In recent days, an extremely dangerous and at the same time illustrative situation has been developing around Venezuela and its oil, which could become a new point of tension between the United States and China. According to analysts and sources in diplomatic circles, Beijing is increasingly approaching a decision that until recently was considered too risky, an attempt to effectively break the maritime blockade of Venezuela imposed by the United States, but to do so not by military means, but under the cover of commerce and international law. This involves escorting oil tankers carrying Venezuelan oil already purchased by Chinese companies to ensure its safe delivery to the global market. Formally, this is not a military operation and not an act of aggression, but protection of commercial interests and Chinese property. Yet in Washington, such a move could be seen as a direct challenge to American pressure strategy. After the fall of the Maduro regime, the United States expected to quickly gain control over Venezuela's oil flows and deprive external actors of the ability to influence the country's energy sector. But the reality proved more complicated. China has invested tens of billions of dollars over many years in Venezuelan oil, infrastructure, and logistics, and is now unwilling to simply write off these investments. According to sources, Beijing views Venezuela not as a temporary asset, but as part of a long-term energy security strategy, especially in the context of instability in the Middle East. This is why Chinese analytical reports increasingly stress that a complete loss of Venezuelan oil would set a dangerous precedent that the United States could repeat in other regions. Against this background, China, according to insiders, is seeking a course of action that would preserve oil flows without leading to direct military confrontation. One such scenario involves escorting tankers under the Chinese flag or with the participation of Chinese security structures, officially tasked with protecting commercial shipping. Experts emphasize that the United States will face a difficult situation. An attack or seizure of such vessels would mean direct confrontation with China and sharp escalation, whereas inaction effectively acknowledges the limits of the American blockade. According to analysts, this dilemma forms the basis of China's calculation. Beijing does not seek war and is not interested in open conflict with the United States, but is prepared to operate at the edge of acceptability, testing how far Washington is willing to go to control Venezuelan oil. It is also important that such steps can be legally justified by China, claiming protection of its property and contracts concluded long before the current crisis. In this case, any harsh U.S. reaction would appear as pressure not on Venezuela, but directly on China, changing the perception of the situation internationally. In Washington, sources report, the risks are understood, which is why actions are cautious, strengthening the interception of the shadow fleet, but avoiding steps that could be interpreted as hostile toward Beijing. Meanwhile, the situation continues to intensify because the interests of the parties converge on one point: the world's largest oil reserves. For the United States, this is a matter of control and influence in the Western Hemisphere. For China, it is a matter of energy security and the principle that forceful redistribution of resources is unacceptable. The longer this confrontation lasts, the higher the likelihood that Venezuela will become an arena of a new format of global conflict, where warships play a secondary role, and the key instruments are commercial convoys, legal mechanisms, and a delicate game on the edge of major war. This is why experts increasingly say that the story of Venezuela is far from over, and China's next steps may determine not only the fate of Venezuelan oil, but also the rules of the game in future global energy crises. At this stage, according to international observers, the key question is not whether China will escort oil shipments from Venezuela, but how exactly it will do so, legally, diplomatically, and operationally. Beijing understands that every step must be carefully calibrated so as not to give Washington a pretext to present the action as a military provocation. This is why experts increasingly discuss a scenario of multi-level civilian cover, in which Chinese companies, insurers, and logistics operators serve as the public face of the operation, while state structures remain in the background. This approach allows Beijing to assert that it is purely protecting commercial interests and international trade, not interfering in a regional conflict. An additional factor is the legal framework. Oil supply contracts concluded long before the current crisis can be used as an argument in international courts and diplomatic forums. In this case, the United States finds itself in a difficult position, since any military action against such convoys would appear as pressure on legitimate commerce, rather than a fight against shadow schemes. Analysts emphasize that this boundary between legitimate commerce and the sanctions regime is becoming the main battlefield. According to sources, China intends to operate precisely here, expanding the gray zone to the limit without crossing formal red lines. At the same time, Beijing is increasing diplomatic activity in Latin America and on multilateral platforms, promoting the narrative of the inadmissibility of extraterritorial sanctions and blockades. For many countries in the region, this is persuasive, since they themselves fear being next in such a situation. Washington recognizes this and therefore acts selectively, focusing on intercepting individual ships and intermediaries while avoiding large-scale operations that could provoke international backlash. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan side, according to sources, is trying to use the confrontation as leverage, navigating between the interests of the United States and China, and seeking to maintain at least some autonomy in managing oil flows. Experts note that such a tactic increases risks, but also expands room for negotiation. All of this reinforces the impression that Venezuela is becoming a testing ground for a new model of global rivalry, where military power is secondary, yielding to economics, law, and logistics. If Chinese convoys begin to regularly sail under commercial cover, it will create a precedent that could be replicated in other regions, from Africa to the Middle East. This is why the situation is being closely monitored not only in Washington and Beijing, but also in the capitals of resource-exporting countries. For the United States, the stakes are high: to maintain the effectiveness of pressure without provoking direct confrontation with China. For Beijing, the goal is to prevent the loss of a strategic asset while simultaneously reinforcing the principle that forceful control over resources has limits. The longer both sides balance on this fine line, the higher the likelihood that the outcome of the Venezuelan crisis will serve as a reference for future energy conflicts, where victory will not go to the one with the most ships, but to the one who can impose their interpretation of legality and permissibility on the world. In this sense, the Venezuelan knot is gradually turning into something more than a regional crisis or a dispute over oil supplies. It is becoming a test of the resilience of the entire system of sanctions and blockades as a tool of global policy. If China succeeds in building a model in which commercial shipments under legal and diplomatic cover effectively neutralize US pressure, this will change calculations not only in Washington, but in many capitals around the world. Sanctions will cease to be a universal lever, and their effectiveness will depend on the willingness of other major players to recognize or challenge the imposed rules. This is why the further development of events around Venezuela will have a domino effect. A successful Chinese scenario will signal to other countries and corporations that even under severe pressure, there is room for maneuver if they act in the gray zone between law and force. Failure, on the other hand, will cement the US role as an arbiter capable of cutting off access to resources regardless of legal arguments. For now, the parties continue a cautious game, avoiding abrupt moves, but the very fact of this game is already shifting the balance.